Harris from Dallas, Texas, and I want to take this opportunity to welcome you to Dallas. I am from Dallas originally. I've lived here most of my adult life. It's my hometown. Could I ask how many of you are from outside of Texas? Well, I want to welcome you to Dallas, and I hope your stay here is enjoyable, memorable, and safe. I hope you leave here with a favorable impression of our town and our people. Jack Ruby once called Dallas a homicidal town. You ought to see it now. But a few years back, there was a gentleman from up north who was traveling down through the southern part of the United States for the first time by car. He was driving through Arkansas. And he stopped at a little roadside stand where a farmer was selling homemade canned goods and syrups and things like that. And this man stopped to purchase some of these items and looked over in an adjacent field, and he said, "My Lord Almighty, what is that thing?" And the farmer said, "Well, that's a razorback hog." He said, "You had never seen one of those?" And he said, "No, that's the biggest thing I ever saw." How long did it take to get to that size? The farmer said, 4 or 5 years. And the man said, "Well, that seems like a long time." The farmer looked at him and said, "What's time to a hog?" And I guess some of the guys in the news media will appreciate this analogy, but I guess a lot of us up here on this panel and in this room are kind of like that hog in that we seem almost oblivious to time as we continue our pursuit for the truth about what happened in Dallas 30 years ago. I think most of us in here would agree that irregardless of the passage of time, be it 30 years or 60 years, the assassination of American head of state cannot remain shrouded in doubt, mystery, and controversy. And yet after 30 years, that remains the legacy of the Kennedy assassination. There's a lot of work to be done. That's part of our purpose in gathering here today. Case closed, my butt. I'm real proud to be up here with this panel. I want to, at the outset, to introduce the members of the panel. I'm real pleased to be on this one because it's made up of first, second, and third generations of researchers. So we represent the 30 years of work that is being done on this case by private citizens all across the country. To my right here is a man I first met back in 1976. He was a reporter for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. He went on to write a book, which some of you may have heard of, called Crossfire. It was, of course, one of the books used as a basis for the movie JFK, made by Oliver Stone, which I think we would all agree was a real turning point in the evolution of this case. I'm real proud to introduce from Fort Worth, actually Springtown, Texas, Jim Mars. On my immediate left here is a young man that I met back in 1975 in the home of Mary Farrell when she was having those infamous Saturday night gatherings that would go virtually all night long, and researchers would gather and discuss and compare notes and brainstorm. And I think someday when we look back, we're going to realize that probably as much progress was made on this case began at Mary Farrell's kitchen table as anywhere else. And I'm proud to introduce from Memphis, Tennessee, a young man who began working with Penn Jones Jr. back in the early 70s, working very closely with Mary Farrell, excellent in the area of examining CIA and FBI documents. I learned a lot from working with these two people. Please welcome from Memphis, Robert Chapman. And then finally, I'm especially proud to introduce the next person. When I started work on the case as an active researcher back in 1975, I was 24 years old, and I began working with Penn Jones Jr. And I thought, well, what can be done at this late date? And Penn assured me that there was a lot to be done and that they were going to need young people to take an interest and get involved in this case and come along behind the first generation of researchers to continue our pursuit of the truth. And I'm real pleased to have on this panel a young man who I think represents a lot to be encouraged about as we move forward on this case. This young man is 17 years old. He's already begun to make a contribution to the case, and before it's over with, this young man will be prominent and will have made a definite contribution to this case. Please welcome from Akron, Ohio, Jonathan Cohen. This is JFK 101. We're going to give you a brief overview and introduction to the Kennedy assassination investigation and its evolution over the past 30 years. And we're going to lead off with Robert Chapman, who's going to talk about what happened that day in Dealey Plaza, and then we will proceed from there. Robert?
Thank you, Larry. The presidential party arrived in Dallas's Love Field just before noon. There was a large, friendly crowd on hand to welcome the president that day. President Kennedy was to travel by motorcade in an open limousine through downtown Dallas and on to the International Trade Mart for a luncheon and a speech he was to give at 12:30. The motorcade moved slowly, averaging about 11 miles per hour, through Dallas streets packed with friendly citizens. The limousine moved down Main Street to Dealey Plaza, where it turned onto Houston Street and then made the sharp turn onto Elm Street in front of the Texas School Book Depository. To understand the assassination, one must understand the geography of Dealey Plaza. East, across from the Texas School Book Depository building, is the building known then as the Dow Tex building. South on Houston Street, across Elm from the Dow Tex, is the County Records building. Next door and south of the Records building is the Criminal Courts building. The arcades and monuments in Dealey Plaza are part of a WPA Works project from the 30s. The arcade just east of the Texas School Book Depository, just west of the Texas School Book Depository, is where Abraham Zapruder was standing, where he took his famous film. Just west of there is the so-called grassy knoll and the picket fence, which lines the top of part of it, ending at the Triple Underpass. Now, the Triple Underpass is a railroad bridge which passes over the 3 streets which flow through Dealey Plaza. The motorcade turned onto Elm Street and had proceeded a few hundred feet down the street when a shot or shots rang out. The president lurched forward, hands grasping at his throat. Then another shot or shots rang out, and Governor Connally cried out in pain and was spun around in his seat by the impact of a bullet. The limousine, by most accounts, slowed down. Finally, the last shot or shots cracked the air. The president's head exploded while his body was slung like a rag doll violently to the left and rear. When the Zapruder film was shown on national television in 1975 through the efforts of Robert Groden, this moment became one of the great historical turning points in the American psyche. And yet, this backward movement was nowhere mentioned in the Warren Report or its 26 volumes of evidence. Surely, there can be no clearer illustration of their intent to defraud us. During this conference, when you see the Zapruder film, those of you who have not seen it will understand this for yourself. Now let's look at the official version of the assassination. According to our government, 3 shots were fired. One missed everything except Jim Tague, who was standing on Commerce under the overpass. A bullet or part of a bullet apparently struck the curb at Tague's feet, and a piece of concrete nicked him on the cheek. Another shot hit the president in the back or his neck, came out the front of his neck, and continued on to strike Governor Connally, hitting him in the upper right back near his armpit, passing through his chest, destroying 5 inches of a rib, exiting his chest below the right nipple, then continued on into his right wrist, breaking the radius, the larger of the two bones and a very dense bone, exiting the wrist, and entered his left thigh where it lodged, leaving a fragment embedded in his femur where it is to this day. This bullet then somehow, a miracle of government work, worked its way out of his thigh, muscle and flesh, and ended up on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital in what most describe as a pristine condition, completely undeformed except for a very slight flattening at the base. This remarkable odyssey is known as the single bullet theory, also known as the magic bullet theory. The third shot, the government tells us, hit the president in the rear of his head, exiting the right front of his head, causing his death. Now, that is what the government has to say about the number of shots and their result. Well, what else does the official version say about events of the shooting? Both government investigations told us that 3 shots were allegedly fired by Lee Harvey Oswald from the easternmost window on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building. They were fired from a rifle, a Mannlicher Carcano, Italian-made World War II vintage rifle, allegedly found hidden on the 6th floor and allegedly purchased by Oswald. Also found on the 6th floor that day, we are told, were 3 empty shell casings, 1 live round in the rifle, and a large paper sack allegedly used by Oswald to carry the rifle into the book depository. The government alleges that Oswald's prints were found on the rifle, on the paper bag, and on a box in the area of the sniper's window, where boxes had been piled up to create a shield or nest. Further, in support of these allegations, our government presents many witnesses who heard only 3 shots, and indeed the majority did seem to hear only 3. And further, that these 3 shots came, says our government, according to all reliable witnesses, only from the Texas School Book Depository. In addition, one witness, Mr. Howard Brennan, actually saw a man shoot twice from the 6th floor and was able to identify him as looking a lot like Lee Harvey Oswald. After the shooting, according to our government, Oswald hid the rifle, came down 4 flights of stairs to the 2nd floor lunchroom, and there was confronted by police officer Marion Baker at gunpoint. Officer Baker had run into the book depository at the sound of the shots. As he entered, he was joined by Roy Truly, superintendent of the book depository. When Officer Baker stopped Oswald, Mr. Truly explained Oswald worked there, and Baker and Truly took off up the stairs headed for the roof. Then, according to the government, Oswald, after politely directing someone to a payphone, left the building. We are told that he first boarded a bus, but then left the bus when it became stuck in traffic. Oswald then walked over to the bus station, and after offering a taxi to a little old lady, this gentleman killer took one for himself and went to his rooming house in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas, arriving there just at 1 o'clock. Does the evidence support these conclusions? That 1 shot hit the president and governor, 1 shot missed, and 1 shot hit the president in his head, with all shots coming from the Texas School Book Depository. Assuming that 1 shot did miss, let's look first at the shot which we are told hit both the president and the governor. Early in the investigation, the FBI established that the Zapruder film ran at 18.3 frames per second and could thus be used as a clock of the assassination. The FBI also established that the Mannlicher Carcano rifle allegedly used could not be fired in under 2.3 seconds. So what a problem they had on their hands when they realized from viewing the Zapruder film that Governor Connally appeared to react to a bullet 1.5 seconds after President Kennedy is seen to react to one. This problem led to the formulation of one of the most controversial claims of the official version of the assassination, namely the single bullet theory. The theory that 1 bullet hit the president, passed through him, hit the governor, passed through him, causing serious trauma and damage to both men, and that this bullet emerged intact and apparently unmarked. The question to be asked here is, could or did 1 bullet, known as Commission Exhibit or CE 399, cause all 7 wounds in both men? Let's look at the nature of those wounds and some of the evidence which our government ignored that cast doubt on the single bullet theory. First of all, was the president struck in the neck or the upper back? The location of this first wound is crucial to the trajectory necessary for the single bullet theory to be possible. The president's death certificate, signed and prepared by Dr. Berkeley, the president's physician who witnessed the events at Parkland and Bethesda, says, quote, "A wound occurred in the posterior back at about the level of the 3rd thoracic vertebra," end quote. This is well below the level of the shoulders, certainly nowhere near the neck. 2 FBI agents, 3 Secret Service agents, all placed the back wound about 5 inches down from the top of the shoulders, exactly where the holes in the president's coat and shirt show a bullet passing. The autopsy face sheet shows, on a diagram of the president's wounds, a back wound at the place noted by the security officers and by the death certificate. This autopsy face sheet is signed as verified by Dr. George Berkeley, the president's personal physician. Well, then, did the wound to the back transit the president's body, leaving the front of his neck? FBI agents Seibert and O'Neill, who were sent to observe and document the autopsy by J. Edgar Hoover, flatly deny any such transit. Also present at the autopsy was Secret Service agent Kellerman, who reported that Dr. Pierre Fink, an autopsy pathologist, while using a metal probe to search the back wound, said, quote, "There are no lanes for an outlet of this entry in this man's shoulder." So ample evidence exists to doubt whether a wound was in the president's neck or back, and if such wound could have transited the body. For if the wound was in the back, where so many reliable witnesses placed it, the trajectory through the body, if it transited and exited the neck, had to be upward and could not have caused Governor Connolly's wounds. Well, was the wound at the front of the neck an entrance wound or an exit wound? The physician who dealt first and directly with the frontal neck wound, Dr. Malcolm Perry, at a press conference on November 22, 1963 at 3:15 Central Standard Time, had this exchange. This is quoted verbatim from a White House transcript which is available at the LBJ Library in Austin. Question: where was the entrance wound? Answer, Dr. Perry: there was an entrance wound in the neck. As regards the one on the head, I cannot say. Question: which way was the bullet coming on the neck wound? At him? Dr. Perry: it appeared to be coming at him. Later in that same conference, Doctor, describe the entrance wound. You think from the front in the throat? Dr. Perry: the wound appeared to be an entrance wound in the front of the throat. Yes, that is correct. In addition to Dr. Perry, Drs. Peters, Jones, Carrico, as well as nurse Nancy Hinchcliffe, all stated in their first reports that the wound in the neck was one of entrance. Now, was Governor Connolly struck by the same bullet as the president? The nature of his wounds are generally agreed upon. It is when he received his wounds and from what bullet that has caused most of the controversy. The problem for the government was that the rifle allegedly used in the shooting could not be fired in under 2.3 seconds, and the Zapruder film showed Governor Connolly reacting to a wound 1.5 seconds after the president is seen reacting. The governor himself did not help their case because, as he told them then, and as he believed until he died this year, he was sure that he was hit by a separate shot than JFK. He clearly remembered hearing a shot, turning his head to the right to see if he could see the president, turning back towards his left to look that way, and when he had gotten squared up, he was struck by a shot which he did not hear. Bullets travel faster than sound, of course, and he had time after hearing the first one to take a conscious action. The government ignored his testimony, but they could not ignore the Zapruder film. So they decided that Governor Connolly had had a delayed reaction to the shot which first struck the president. There are lots of problems with this, but the question must be asked, is a delayed reaction to a force possible? If he had been hit simply in fatty tissues, a delayed reaction might have been conceivable. But he had had 2 large bones shattered, and the force of the missile clearly spins him about in his seat. Let's consider then whether one bullet, CE-399, the so-called magic bullet, could have caused all of Governor Connolly's wounds. Dr. Robert Shaw, who operated on Governor Connolly at Parkland Hospital, told the Warren Commission he did not believe one bullet caused all of the governor's wounds because of the amounts of fragments recovered from the wounds. In 1992, at a press conference sponsored here in Dallas by the Dallas Council on World Affairs, many of us heard Dr. Shaw again affirm flatly that CE-399 was not the only bullet to hit the governor. Indeed, Dr. Shaw does not believe that CE-399 hit Connolly at all, nor did the president's autopsy doctor, Dr. Humes. When asked in 1964 by Arlen Specter if CE-399 could have caused all of the governor's wounds, Dr. Humes flatly denied it was possible. So how, may we ask, did both the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations conclude that the single bullet theory had merit. Perhaps it was because, as Dr. Michael Baden told the House Select Committee on Assassinations, they felt they had no evidence of a shot going elsewhere. Of course, they had to ignore all the evidence that the president's rear neck wound was really a back wound and did not transit the body, and ignore the evidence that the president's front neck wound was an entrance wound which did not transit his body either. And they ignored testimony from many doctors who were certain that Governor Connolly's wounds could not have been inflicted by the single intact bullet CE 399. The government needed a single bullet theory, the government created the single bullet theory, and in spite of every aspect of this theory being contradicted by the evidence, far more evidence than time permits me to develop here today, our government maintains the fiction of a single bullet theory. Concerning the shot which struck the president in the head, we were told by the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee that a shot from the rear hit the president in the back of his head, either at the level of the occipital protuberance or 4 inches higher, depending on whom you believe, and exited out of the top right of his head. Is there evidence that this shot came from another direction? First, the majority of the doctors at Parkland Hospital saw a rear exit wound in the back of the president's head, and many believed it was a tangential wound striking on the side of the head, blowing out the rear of the head. Were there witnesses in Dealey Plaza that felt the headshot came from the front? A great many people, in fact, heard shots that seemed to come from the so-called grassy knoll to the right front of the presidential limousine as it moved down Elm Street. In one study that I have seen of 25 people who were asked by law enforcement over the weekend of November 22nd, 24, 1963, which direction shots came from, 22 indicated at least one shot came from the front. Virtually all of the witnesses who were on or near the knoll heard gunshots and or saw evidence of gunshots coming from the knoll. Many, including police officers, smelled gunpowder heavy in the air behind the picket fence on the knoll. Witnesses who were in this area include Bill and Gail Newman. They were at the foot of the knoll on the north side of Elm Street, directly beside the president when he received his fatal wound. In 1966, Bill Newman told author Josiah Thompson, quote, "Well, of course, the president's being shot in the side of the head by the third shot. I thought the shot was fired from directly above and behind where we were standing," end quote. The grassy knoll was directly above and behind Mr. and Ms. Newman. Another witness, Emmett Hudson, was standing on the steps which climb up the knoll. Hudson told this to the FBI when asked about the shots. Quote, Hudson said the shots sounded as if they were fired over his head and from some position to the left of where he was standing. In other words, the shots sounded as if they were fired by someone at a position which was behind him, which was above him, and which was to his left. That was the location of the picket fence on the grassy knoll. Jean Hill, who was directly across Elm Street from the Newmans, told the Warren Commission she felt the shots came from the knoll. Abraham Zapruder is on the record at least twice as saying the shots came from behind him. He, of course, was standing on the grassy knoll. S.M. Holland was standing on the triple overpass during the assassination. Mr. Holland heard at least one shot which came from the picket fence on the knoll, and Holland was absolutely sure that this shot hit the president in the head. He and several of his co-workers with him on the overpass all heard at least one shot from the knoll, and all saw smoke after that shot, which appeared to issue from the picket fence on the knoll. Dallas Police Officer Bobby Hargis, who was right next to the presidential limousine at its left rear, told the Warren Commission the shots sounded, quote, right next to him, end quote, that they seemed to come from the direction of the railroad overpass. The shot which struck the president in the head sent a massive amount of blood, bone, and brain slamming into Officer Hargis. Immediately after the shots, Officer Hargis dropped his motorcycle and ran up the knoll to look behind the picket fence. Positioned behind the picket fence that day was Lee Bowers. Mr. Bowers was working for the Union Terminal Railroad as a tower man. From his position on this tower, 14 feet above ground, he looked out over the entire knoll area behind the picket fence. Mr. Bowers saw two men standing behind the fence, facing and looking towards the motorcade. At the moment of the shooting, Bowers told the Warren Commission that something unusual happened near the fence where the two men were standing. Mr. Bowers was not asked to elaborate by the Warren Commission staff. When afforded the opportunity to elaborate by Mark Lane, Bowers stated that he felt the unusual occurrence was a flash of light or smoke. So did the Warren Commission have any reliable witnesses that shots may have come from the front? The evidence has always been clear that they did. What about shots from the rear? Were there shots from the Texas School Book Depository building? It would seem that at least some shots did come from the book depository. Many witnesses heard shots which seemed to come from there. Did anyone see someone shooting from the book depository? A witness named Howard Brennan was at the corner of Elm and Houston Streets facing directly the Texas School Book Depository. Mr. Brennan, in an FBI report on November 22nd, stated that he saw a man fire 2 shots from the 6th floor of the School Book Depository. The Warren Commission told us in their report that Howard Brennan, when he viewed the first lineup on the night of November 22nd, declined to make a positive ID of Lee Harvey Oswald as the man he saw shooting that day from the School Book Depository. Then on December 17th, Brennan changed his mind and said, yes, it was Lee Harvey Oswald. Then on January 7th, 1964, Brennan again changed his mind and said, no, it was not Lee Harvey Oswald. Ultimately, even the Warren Commission was forced to admit that Mr. Brennan did not know who he saw doing some shooting that day. Well then, if shots were fired from the 6th floor of the School Book Depository building, could Lee Harvey Oswald have been the man who fired them? The Warren Commission tells us that Oswald shot the president from the southeast corner window of the 6th floor at 12:30, then crossed the floor to the northeast corner, hid the rifle, took the stairs down to the 2nd floor lunchroom. Tests later established that he could have reached this floor in 1 minute 14 seconds. It was there that he was encountered by Officer Marion Baker and Texas School Book Depository Superintendent Roy Truly. Officer Baker was outside when the shots were fired and immediately ran in, headed for the roof to investigate. Tests later showed that Officer Baker took about 1 minute 18 seconds to reach the 2nd floor lunchroom. So if these reconstructions are correct, both men arrived at the 2nd floor lunchroom within seconds of each other. There are a number of problems with this, but one of the largest was uncovered during the House Select Committee investigation when it was discovered that the photos taken of the facade of the book depository showing the 6th floor before and just after the shots, when compared, revealed that boxes of the so-called sniper's nest had been rearranged after the shots. And there is the FBI report of the statement of Mrs. Lillian Mooneyham, who told the FBI that 4 or 5 minutes after the shots, she saw a man standing on the 6th floor of the book depository building behind some cardboard boxes. She was watching from an office in the Dallas Criminal Courts building, which is across from and south of the School Book Depository. Now, while all this was going on, Oswald was being encountered on the 2nd floor by Officer Baker and Roy Truly. By the way, the 2nd floor lunchroom is where Oswald told police he was during the assassination, eating his lunch. Officer Baker, when asked by the Warren Commission for a written description of the encounter, wrote one out in longhand. He originally wrote that when he encountered Oswald, Oswald was drinking a Coke. Officer Baker drew a line through that statement and initialed the correction. Of course, if Oswald had time to buy a Coke and begin drinking it, the matter of timing is further weakened for the Warren Commission. Yet we learn, in the testimony of Mrs. Robert Reed, that just moments after Oswald's encounter with Officer Baker, she saw Oswald with a Coke in his hand. We know from his testimony and that of Mr. Truly's that Officer Baker and Mr. Truly never saw Oswald after the brief encounter on the 2nd floor. So the question must be asked, if Oswald did not have a Coke in his hands when stopped by Officer Baker, is Officer Baker a psychic? How could he have known that Oswald would buy a Coke which was seen by Mrs. Reed? Further substantiation of Oswald's claim to have been on the 2nd floor in the lunchroom was presented by Anthony Summers in his book Conspiracy. In 1978, Mr. Summers found and interviewed Carolyn Arnold, who in 1963 was secretary to the vice president of the Texas School Book Depository. Mrs. Arnold had never seen her FBI report, which, it appears, badly misquoted her in 1963. She told Summers she saw Oswald eating lunch on the 2nd floor lunchroom at 12:15 or later. Oswald was in the habit of getting change from Mrs. Arnold to use in the lunchroom, and she was thus familiar with him. Yes, Oswald could have finished lunch and gone upstairs to shoot the president. But we have the statement of Arnold Rowland, who was standing across from the book depository on Houston Street and saw two men on the 6th floor of the book depository at 12:15, one of whom was holding a rifle. Rowland was able to fix the time with certainty because of a police radio broadcast which he had heard at the moment, which gave the position of the motorcade en route. Later examination of the police radio log showed the time of that broadcast to be 12:15 to 12:16, just when Mrs. Arnold saw Oswald in the lunchroom. It should also be noted that there were numerous other witnesses who told authorities of seeing two men on the 6th floor just before or after during the assassination. Now, given all of these facts, there is reasonable doubt as to Lee Harvey Oswald's presence on the 6th floor after 12:15, and good cause to believe that he was, in fact, on the 2nd floor during the assassination. After the assassination, Oswald first gave directions to someone looking for a payphone and then left the book depository. He apparently boarded a bus to ride home, yet the evidence for that has been questioned. And then, when the bus was stopped in traffic around Dealey Plaza, he left the bus and walked to the bus station. There, we are told that this desperate assassin first offered up a taxi to a little old lady and then entered a cab of his own and was driven to an area near his rooming house where he arrived around 1 p.m.
Thank you, Robert. What I'm going to do is, from that point, pick up the official version of what transpired, and then we're going to backtrack a little bit and look at it a little more carefully. According to the Warren report, Oswald took a taxi cab to his room, got out several blocks past his room, and walked back. Was in his room not more than 3 or 4 minutes. He may or may not have changed some articles of clothing. He apparently picked up a jacket and apparently picked up a .38 Smith & Wesson revolver, which he owned. He left his rooming house, began walking, his destination not known. The commission couldn't even really speculate as to what Oswald's destination or intent might have been. They say he walked a distance of about a mile and was walking down a quiet residential street in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas, 10th Street, when he was encountered by a Dallas policeman patrolling the area, who came upon him from behind, suspected from the radio broadcast of the suspect over in Dealey Plaza that this might be the assassin, and apparently tried to question or detain him. They conversed briefly. The officer got out of his car, apparently started around to apprehend this man, and was shot 4 times and died instantly. Oswald fled the scene, discarding shells from his pistol as he left on foot, disappeared around the corner, went to Jefferson Boulevard, which is in the central business district of Oak Cliff, the main shopping strip in that part of the city, discarded his jacket near a service station on Jefferson, and walked some 6/10 of a mile to the Texas Theater, where he ran in or rushed in without paying for a ticket. He was observed by a couple of people who notified the police. A large contingent of Dallas police officers, a couple of FBI agents, some constables, sheriff's deputies converged on the Texas Theater, went inside. Oswald, at some point, was pointed out to them by a nearby shopkeeper, was approached by a Dallas policeman. Oswald allegedly tried to pull his revolver from his waistband and shoot this police officer. The officer struck him, they scuffled, and Oswald was subdued after a little hassle and tuggle with a large number of policemen who beat him as he resisted arrest, they said, and shouted out he was not resisting arrest. He was taken into custody and transported downtown to police headquarters. Over in Dealey Plaza, it had been determined that an employee of the school book depository, namely Oswald, was missing from the building, and police were dispatched to Irving, Texas, where his wife Marina was living with a friend named Ruth Payne. Meanwhile, the officers from Oak Cliff show up with Oswald in tow. Captain Fritz, who was directing the investigation, was telling the officers to go out to Irving, get a search warrant, and pick up this Lee Harvey Oswald. And one of the officers said, "Well, Captain, we can save you a trip. Here he sits." Oswald was interrogated throughout that weekend for about 11 or 12 hours by Dallas police as well as the FBI and Secret Service. He was placed in 4 lineups for the benefit of eyewitnesses to both the assassination as well as the murder of Officer Tippit. And during this entire period, he was without legal representation. Throughout his time in custody, Oswald adamantly maintained his innocence, and in fact at one point shouted out to reporters, "I'm just a patsy." On Sunday morning, on Friday night at about 7 or 7:30, Oswald was formally charged with the murder of Officer Tippit based on some eyewitness identifications in a lineup. Around 1:30 a.m. on Saturday, November 23rd, Oswald was charged formally with the murder of President Kennedy. However, it is not clear that he was formally arraigned for that murder. That's still an open question as to whether or not he was ever formally arraigned and informed of those charges against him. On Sunday morning, there was a final brief interrogation session, and the police were going to transfer Oswald from police headquarters to the Dallas County Sheriff's Office on the overlooking Dealey Plaza. And that was a standard procedure for prisoners back in those days. They had an elaborate security plan in place which involved the use of an armored car which would be used as a decoy, and Oswald would be taken secretly in an undercover car to the Sheriff's Department. To cooperate with the news media who were complaining about limited access to Oswald and not being able to get footage of Oswald or question of Oswald, they allowed the news media into the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters. Meanwhile, a Dallas nightclub owner named Jack Ruby showed up at police headquarters, and it appears that there was a very brief interval, perhaps a minute, between the time Ruby entered the basement into police headquarters and the time Oswald appeared being brought down from the 3rd floor where he was being questioned. And I think we all know what happened next. As Oswald was being led out, Jack Ruby lunged forward and fired one shot into Oswald's abdomen, was immediately subdued. Oswald was taken to Parkland Hospital and pronounced dead a short time later. As it turned out, Jack Ruby had been a familiar face around police headquarters throughout that weekend. He was there Friday afternoon, Friday evening. He was up on the 3rd floor where Oswald was being held. The police denied that Ruby was ever gained access to the area where Oswald was being questioned. However, a few years ago, the JFK Assassination Information Center did extensive interviews with a retired lieutenant of the Dallas Police Department who reported for duty that afternoon and told us very frankly and adamantly that when he reported for duty and went to the Homicide Bureau there on the 3rd floor, Jack Ruby was inside the Homicide Bureau. He had brought sandwiches for the officers, and Oswald was in a small interviewing room just adjacent to this outer office. But this retired lieutenant did tell us that when he arrived there at the Homicide, Ruby was in fact inside the Homicide office. On Saturday, there's a big chunk of time of Ruby's movements that are unaccounted for. We don't know just what he was up to, who he may have been meeting with. He did appear at police headquarters and seemed most inquisitive as to how the investigation was going, where was Oswald, when would they move Oswald. On Sunday morning, he showed up and was in place and in position to shoot Oswald despite stringent security and being surrounded by no less than 70 armed officers. Now I want to backtrack just a moment to when Oswald left his rooming house, and I want to spend just a brief amount of time with the Tippit murder because it's very important. That is a pivotal event in this whole thing. The Tippit murder is the bridge from Dealey Plaza to the arrest of Oswald, and it's important to try to put that in perspective. According to the Warren report, Oswald left his room at 1:04 p.m. and began walking, destination unknown. The police were notified of the Tippit shooting by a citizen using the radio in Tippit's car at 1:16 p.m. So from 1:04 to 1:16 p.m. is a window of 12 minutes that Oswald had to walk the approximate 1 mile from the rooming house to where Tippit was slain. And the commission could not even really speculate as to his destination. No one ever came forward in 1964 along that 1 mile route who professed to see Oswald. It was sheer conjecture on the part of the commission. From the time Oswald left his rooming house until the time he shows up over by the theater, it's just really not at all clear where he was or if in fact he was anywhere near 10th and Patton. So 12 minutes Oswald has to walk the distance of 1 mile. Now later when David Bellin of the Warren Commission, who wrote the chapter on the Tippit murder as well as the identification of Oswald as Kennedy's assassin, when Bellin retraced Oswald's presumed route with a stopwatch, it took him 17 minutes and 45 seconds. And yet Oswald had no more than 12 minutes. But this is very important. The landlady at his rooming house testified that a few minutes after Oswald left his rooming house, she looked out the front window and observed Oswald standing there at the curb near a bus stop just adjacent to the rooming house. Therefore, there were several minutes later, after 1:04, Oswald is still in the immediate vicinity of his rooming house. Conversely, it was clear that several minutes elapsed between the time Tippit was shot and the time the police were actually notified of the shooting. Domingo Benavides, a passerby, testified that when the shooting broke out, he pulled his truck into the curb and crouched down low. And he said that he remained there for a few minutes because he was afraid the gunman might come back and start shooting. Therefore, a few minutes elapsed between the time of the shooting and the time the police were notified. And even then, after Benavides finally came out of his truck, he first tried to aid Officer Tippit, who was mortally wounded, and then decided to try to use the radio, and he didn't know how to operate that. And a passerby came upon the scene, a man named Boley, who gave an affidavit that he stopped, got out, and he's the only known witness who actually deliberately checked the time. And he stated in his affidavit that it was 1:10 p.m. when he came upon the scene and Officer Tippit was lying in the street. And it was Bowley, in fact, who took the microphone from Benavides and notified the radio operator at police headquarters that an officer had been shot. So that 12-minute window of opportunity that Oswald had to get to the scene of the crime is narrowed significantly by the landlady and by Benavides. So that window of opportunity narrows significantly, and it raises the very, very real question: could Oswald even possibly have been the individual over there who carried out the shooting? Now, moreover, the Warren report said that Oswald was walking east on 10th Street. This is a quiet residential street 4 miles from Dealey Plaza and a mile from Oswald's rooming house. But you go back and read all of the Dallas Police, FBI, and Secret Service reports, the contemporaneous reports from that weekend, and they state almost without exception that the man who shot Tippit was walking west on 10th Street and continued west after the shooting. Now, if this was Oswald walking west, it would have presented a problem for the Warren Commission, and this was one of the problems that they had to deal with early on, because if Oswald was walking west on 10th Street, that would have him coming back toward his rooming house from a point beyond the crime scene that he could not possibly have reached in this 12-minute time span that has been established. And in fact, one of the key witnesses, a taxi driver named Bill Scoggins, who was parked nearby, vividly described Tippit's police car driving slowly past him as it cruised east on 10th Street. He was sitting there eating his lunch. He didn't say anything about Oswald moments earlier walking directly in front of his cab, as he would have done if he'd been walking east on 10th, as the Warren Commission said. And in fact, you go back and read the interviews, the affidavit, FBI and police interviews with Scoggins, the taxi driver, and he states in all three of the reports that are in the public record that the man was walking west on 10th prior to the encounter with the police officer. Also, a witness named Jimmy Burt, who lived in the next block, was sitting on his front porch and casually observed the man walking west on 10th Street. Burt got up, went in his house, and heard the shots, came back out, and saw this same man that had passed just a few moments earlier standing down at the police car looking at the officer on the ground. So there's a very real question as to just where was Oswald, could he have been there? And I think the known facts raise a very real possibility he was not at 10th and Patton at the time of the shooting. The Warren Commission relied on three witnesses as the cornerstone for their case against Oswald in the Tippit shooting. The first of these was a waitress named Helen Markham, who was standing on the street corner waiting to cross the street. And she became the star witness for the police and later the Warren Commission, and is the sole basis for the Warren report's contention that Oswald was walking east rather than west on 10th Street. And Markham allegedly picked Oswald out of the first of 4 police lineups that afternoon, even though she was hysterical and feigning to such an extent that they were preparing to transport her to a hospital. Nonetheless, we're told she did pick Oswald out of a lineup, even though she'd told the FBI that same afternoon that the man who shot Tippit was 18 years old, red-complected, and had black, wavy hair. And you'll recall that Oswald was 24, fair-skinned, and had short brown hair. And in fact, a number of the descriptions going out over the police radio of the suspect in the Tippit shooting, they include references to black hair. That seems to be one of the common denominators on this man who shot Tippit. And I don't think anyone would mistake Oswald's short brown hair for black hair or black wavy hair. Now, publicly, the Warren report said that Helen Markham's testimony was credible, and she, in fact, was a star witness in the Tippit murder. But that's what they said publicly, but behind the scenes, Helen Markham earned the contempt of the Warren Commission staff attorneys, and they ridiculed her in private. Joe Ball complained that her account was full of mistakes and utterly unreliable. And Wesley Lieber dismissed her story as contradictory and worthless. In fact, a couple of years later, in a public debate, Ball called Markham in public an utter screwball. And so she was not the reliable witness that we were assured she was by the Warren report. Another witness was the taxi driver Bill Scoggins, who I've mentioned. He purportedly picked Oswald out of the lineup on Saturday afternoon, but an FBI report revealed that 2 days later, when FBI agents showed him a photograph of Oswald, Scoggins told them he couldn't be sure the person he observed on November 22nd was actually identical with Oswald. And in fact, when he testified before the Warren Commission, Scoggins rather sheepishly admitted that he was shown a series of photographs of men, including Oswald, and he selected the wrong photograph, selected a man other than Oswald as the Tippit gunman. And then the third eyewitness was Domingo Benavides, an auto mechanic who was the closest person. He said he was about 15 feet away in his pickup truck when the shooting broke out, and he ducked down in the cab of his truck. And yet he was not taken to any of the police lineups because he told investigators he was pretty sure he could not identify the killer. And later, when he appeared before the Warren Commission, the best they could get out of him was a tentative identification. He would say only that a picture of Oswald he saw on TV resembled the man who shot Tippit. Now, these police lineups, the Warren report places a lot of emphasis on these 4 police lineups, but I must tell you, they were a travesty. In the first 2, Oswald, who was disheveled and bruised, was paraded before witnesses in the company of 2 police detectives and a jail clerk who were neatly attired in their civilian clothing and quite a bit older and heavier. One of them had blonde hair. They in no way had a similar appearance to Oswald, so Oswald stood out rather clearly. And during at least 3 and possibly all 4 of the lineups, Oswald was angrily and loudly protesting to the police about how unfair these lineups were. He was demanding his lawyer, telling them that they were trying to railroad him. And so it was, these were boisterous police lineups. And in 1979, I asked Dr. Robert Buckout, who is a leading U.S. expert on eyewitness testimony and identification procedures, to evaluate the Dallas police lineups. He did so and concluded, by any stretch of the imagination, virtually every rule in the book was violated in the conduct of these lineups. The results of any of the lineups, conducted as poorly and under as hysterical circumstances as they were, should be regarded as utterly worthless. Now, there were 3 other witnesses who were not known to the Warren Commission or did not appear before the Warren Commission, but who gave their accounts later to independent researchers. And their accounts vary wildly from the other accounts that we have. One of these was a housekeeper named Aquila Clemens, who said she heard gunshots. She lived in the next block. She ran out to see what was going on and said she saw 2 men standing at Tippit's police car, and that one was tall, one was short, and the tall one motioned to the other one to go on, and that they ran off in opposite directions. No one else saw this. Another witness was named Frank Wright, who lived a block down. He heard gunshots, went out to see what was going on, and looked down the street and saw a policeman, or saw somebody lying in the street, and a man standing over him. The man stood there watching the man on the street, and then ran beyond the police car, jumped into a gray car which was parked beyond it, and sped off west on 10th Street. No one else saw this. And then in the 1970s, a man named Jack Tatum gave his account to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Tatum was driving west on 10th Street, passed Tippett's squad car, went through the intersection of 10th and Patton when he heard gunfire. He kind of pulled over, looked back, saw the policeman lying in the street, and the man standing near the curb. This man fired the shots across the hood of Tippett's police car. According to Tatum, the man with the gun came back around behind Tippett's patrol car and around on the driver's side and walked up to Tippett, took careful, deliberate aim, and fired one more shot into Tippett. Nobody else saw this. The House Select Committee noted of Tatum's account, this action, the separate shot, which is commonly described as the coup de grace, is more indicative of an execution than an act of defense intended to allow escape or prevent apprehension. Absent further evidence, which the committee did not develop, the meaning of this evidence must remain uncertain. The ballistics evidence in the Tippett murder has always been controversial. 4 bullets were taken from Tippett's body. 4 shells were allegedly recovered at the scene, so you would think investigators would have no problem matching up the 4 and 4, but you would be mistaken. It is a fact that of the 4 bullets removed from Tippett's body, none of the 4 bullets could be traced to Oswald's revolver. Now, ostensibly, this was because Oswald's .38 Smith & Wesson revolver had been modified, rebarreled, and they were unable to identify characteristics on the bullet which could be traced to that gun to the exclusion of all others. And that is a fact. The bullets from Tippett's body were never traced to Oswald's revolver. And years later, the Select Committee on Assassinations tried to do the same thing with new techniques and sophisticated technology that did not exist in 1964. They were unable to trace those bullets to Oswald's revolver. Another problem was that the bullets from Tippett's body, 3 were manufactured by Western Winchester and 1 by Remington Peters. But two of the shell casings found at the scene were made by Western Winchester, and 2 were made by Remington Peters. So you had 3 in 1 and 2 in 2. Difference in the brand. And the Warren Commission was never able to provide a really satisfactory explanation for that discrepancy, and it remains unexplained to this date. Now, in the final analysis, these 4 shell casings are the only tangible evidence linking Oswald's pistol and Oswald, I suppose, to the Tippett murder. But when there's no question that the shells turned over to the Warren Commission were fired from Oswald's revolver. Nobody disputes that. The question is, when were those shells fired in that revolver? And the question also becomes, were those in fact the same shells found at the scene on November 22nd, which were later received by the Warren Commission? Now, the second description of the suspect to go out over the police radio of the Tippett gunman stated that he was armed with a dark finish automatic handgun. And just a few minutes later, Sergeant Jerry Hill of the Dallas Police went on the radio from the scene and informed the radio dispatcher that the shell at the scene indicates the suspect is armed with an automatic rather than a revolver. And this is significant because Oswald was carrying a 6-shot 38 Smith & Wesson revolver. An automatic handgun and a revolver are 2 different types of handguns altogether, and the ammunition that they fire is different in shape and size. And so you have 2 indications here in the police record that Tippett was slain with an automatic weapon. Oswald was not carrying an automatic weapon at the time of his arrest. And I don't think a veteran police sergeant like Sergeant Jerry Hill, who admits he handled the shells, would make a mistake like that, would misidentify an automatic shell casing from a revolver shell casing. And then uncertainty about the ballistics evidence only grew with the revelation that a Dallas policeman at the scene, a patrolman named Poe, took custody of 2 of the shell casings. And he was directed to scratch his initials into them to initiate a chain of evidence. And he did so. Now, several months later, in June of '64, the FBI took all 4 of the shell casings to Poe and asked him to find his marks, and he examined all 4 shells very carefully. He could not find his marks, therefore he was unable to positively identify any of those shell casings as being the same ones that he'd found on November 22nd. So all of this, raises the possibility of police tampering with the evidence. Specifically the ballistics evidence. There was one other piece of evidence, which was a white jacket. A few blocks away on a service station parking lot, police found a white jacket underneath the car. Later, the Warren Commission was given by the Dallas Police Department a gray jacket. And in fact, it is described officially in the 26 volumes as a gray zipper jacket. And I've examined this jacket, held it in my hands at the National Archives, and it is a gray jacket. You might call it light gray, but you wouldn't call it white or even off-white. But the officer who found the jacket and radioed into the police dispatcher called it white, and the few references to the jacket that weekend all state that it was a white jacket which was found at the scene. But the jacket the Warren Commission given was gray. There was a commercial laundry tag stapled inside this jacket that was found, and there was also a laundry mark, a stenciled laundry mark, which indicated it had recently been professionally dry cleaned. And the Warren report never mentioned that at its request, the FBI had undertook an extensive investigation of all the dry cleaning establishments in the greater Dallas-Fort Worth area as well as the greater New Orleans area where Oswald had lived during the summer of '63. The FBI said it was not able to trace either the laundry tag or the laundry mark to Oswald. In fact, the same FBI investigation determined that Marina Oswald hand-washed all of her husband's clothing and that she never knew of him to use a commercial cleaner, and that's consistent with what we know about Oswald, who was very frugal. And whereas this jacket turned over to the commission was a size medium, all of Oswald's other clothing, including another jacket found, were size small. Only one of 6 eyewitnesses who were shown the gray jacket stated positively that it was the one worn by Tippett's killer, and the descriptions by the various witnesses varied and in several instances were completely inconsistent with the commission's gray jacket. And Oswald's landlady, who was the last person to see him when he left his room, could not identify the commission's gray jacket as the one he was wearing when he left his room at 1:04 p.m. That pretty much wraps up my segment on the Tippett murder, but I think that anyone who studies the evidence objectively and in its entirety will come away disturbed by what they find, because there's a lot of indications that Oswald was not the Tippett killer, that he was nowhere near there. In fact, a couple of witnesses at the theater place Oswald inside the Texas Theater much earlier than the Warren report indicated, prior to 1:15 p.m. in fact. And if these accounts are correct, it only further corroborates that Oswald was not near 10th and Patton when this policeman was shot. So in closing, it's unfortunate that the Tippett murder has been virtually relegated to footnote status in history. You know, when the House Select Committee reopened the investigation in the 70s, came out with the final report, they devoted a scant 3 paragraphs to the Tippett murder and concurred with the Warren Commission findings that Oswald was the killer of Tippett. And it's ironic because back at the time, 30 years ago, it was the Tippett murder which led police to Oswald, and it was the Tippett murder which went a long way in persuading the public that Oswald killed a policeman and therefore probably killed President Kennedy, because the Tippett murder at that time and even now is depicted as virtually an open and shut case against Oswald. But I think if you'll read up and study the record, you'll find that the Warren Commission findings leave a lot to be desired, and there's a lot about the Tippett murder that we don't know. It seems at this late date we may never be able to resolve the Tippett murder, and it seems at this point at least that it seems destined to remain the other unsolved murder on November 22nd. Now from here we're going to seek over to Jonathan Cohen, who is going to talk with us some about the medical evidence. We'll wrap it up with Jim a little bit later, and then we will have time for a brief question and answer period. Jonathan?
Thank you. In order to properly convey the conflicts in the medical evidence, I want to start with the observations of the wounds in Dealey Plaza and at Parkland Hospital, the people that first saw President Kennedy immediately after the assassination. And there is substantial evidence, based on the descriptions of the wounds, that President Kennedy was shot twice from the front, once in the throat and once in the head. And nearly every description of the head wound that was made in Dallas, either by Dealey Plaza witnesses or by Parkland witnesses, describes the back of the head as being blown out. After the headshot, brain material was sprayed all over the place. A lot of it went backward, and Robert mentioned that officers Hargis and Martin were pelted by brain, bone, and blood so hard that some of them described that they felt like they were being shot themselves. A skull fragment from Kennedy's head was found in the grass behind the limousine. You'll hear varying descriptions as to what part of the skull that was from, but it was identified by a doctor as being a fragment from the occipital area of the head, which is the back of the head. Agent Clint Hill and Jackie Kennedy observed the exit wound in the back of Kennedy's head. They saw it seconds after it happened. Witnesses Gene Hill, Beverly Oliver, and Phil Willis all described the damage to the back of the head. President Kennedy was rushed to Parkland Hospital after the assassination. The Dallas doctors were told only that he had been shot. Yet, every doctor places the large wound in the back of the head. Just to run down some descriptions, Dr. Charles Crenshaw describes the wound in the occipital-parietal area of the back of the head. Dr. Pepper Jenkins describes that a segment of bone was blown out, either a segment of occipital or temporal bone. Dr. Carrico describes the gaping wound in the occipital-parietal area. Dr. McClellan describes the right posterior portion of the skull being extremely blasted. The list goes on and on. Aside from the fact that the emergency room nurses saw the exact same thing, the wound in the same location, 7 of these doctors reported that the cerebellum was damaged and was hanging from the wound. Unfortunately, the photographs of the autopsy show no such thing. Then the cerebellum was intact. We have numerous other witnesses reporting the wound of exit in the back of the head. There's evidence of a bullet entrance wound in the right temple area. The morticians at Bethesda who were preparing Kennedy's body for burial described filling in some areas in the temple with wax, and Kennedy's secretary, Malcolm Kilduff, during a press conference immediately after Kennedy expired, points to his right temple when he's asked how President Kennedy died. President Kennedy was also shot in the throat, and in order for the single bullet theory to stand up, the magic bullet, which is Commission Exhibit 399, must have passed through his back and out his throat before it continued on to wound Governor Connally. And nobody at Parkland Hospital noticed a wound in Kennedy's back, perhaps leading them to believe that the throat wound was one of entry. And in any case, the wound in the front of the throat was noticed, and it was described as being about 1/4 of an inch in diameter. Dr. Perry called the wound an entrance wound 3 times during a news conference. But unfortunately, a tracheotomy was made right through that wound. And this changed the appearance of it to anyone who was going to see it later. And as we're going to hear, that caused a lot of problems. So again, the opinion of the Dallas doctors quickly after the assassination was that Kennedy had been shot in the head and the throat from the front. But before an autopsy could be performed at Parkland, which was required by Texas law, the body was physically removed at gunpoint, put on Air Force One, and the presidential party departed. From that point, second set of medical opinions were generated. That would be by the personnel at Bethesda Medical Center and the doctors who performed the autopsy there. So we have some controversy over the choice of Bethesda instead of Walter Reed Hospital. If you look into some of the transcripts of the radio transmissions from Air Force One, it seems to indicate that the original plan was for the body to go to Walter Reed, but in any case, it did wind up at Bethesda Medical Center. And the 2 pathologists at Bethesda were Commander James Humes and Commander J. Thornton Boswell. Both were clinical pathologists dealing almost exclusively in natural death. They had basically no experience whatsoever in cases involving gunshot wounds, and I believe it was because of this that the doctors asked for Colonel Pierre Fink, who was a pathologist at Walter Reed, to assist them, and there was considerable delay waiting for him to arrive. So finally, the autopsy began. A number of x-rays were taken, and the room was cleared because of the radiation from the machine. First incision was made shortly thereafter. By midnight, after the autopsy was complete, Dr. Humes had come to some definite conclusions. That President Kennedy was struck by 2 shots from the rear, not from the front as described by the physicians in Dallas. And there are some troubling discrepancies in the size of Kennedy's wounds at Parkland versus those at Bethesda, especially with the head wound. The hole across the head basically doubled in size. The hole in the head, which was chiefly occipital, the back of the head in Dallas, became chiefly parietal, more towards the front of the head in Bethesda. The implication of these 2 wound discrepancies is the following. Parkland was right and Bethesda was wrong, or Bethesda was right and Parkland was wrong. If Parkland was right, then Doctors Humes, Boswell, and Fink missed the wound in the occiput. They also missed the fact that it quadrupled in size. If Bethesda was right, then everyone at Parkland missed a 5 1/8 inch hole at the top of Kennedy's head, as well as an entry wound in his hairline. So let's take a look at the wounds in JFK's back and in his throat. Dr. Fink testified to the Clay Shaw trial in New Orleans in 1968 that the wound in the back was probed, and it was shallow, No lane of continuation could be found throughout the body. If this is true, it is a wonderment that the bullet continued upward and out Kennedy's throat, never mind the fact that it continued on to hit Governor Connally. But as stated before, the wound in Kennedy's throat changed appearance because the tracheotomy was made through it. But as most of us know, Dr. Humes did not realize that that wound contained a bullet wound until the next day when he talked to the Dallas doctors. They had no idea that it was anything other than tracheotomy incision. So the FBI states their original conclusions were that 3 shots were fired. Connally was struck once, Kennedy struck twice. No need for the single bullet theory yet. But ironclad evidence of a missed shot in the fact that Jim Tague was nicked by a bullet fragment, the Warren Commission was faced with a problem. How do they account for all the non-fatal wounds with 1 bullet? So before I get into the single bullet theory, which Robert talked about, I want to take a look at some of the other problems that happened at Bethesda, as well as the photographs and the x-rays. To start with President Kennedy's brain. The brain was removed and fixed in a solution of formalin for later investigation. And according to the supplementary autopsy report, which was done about 2 weeks after the assassination on the brain, tissue slides were taken from various sections. But the brain and the tissue slides are missing from the National Archives. The brain was not sectioned, and according to a number of medical witnesses, this procedure would have definitively proven the bullet tracks throughout the head. The photographs taken of the brain were not included in the set reviewed by the House Select Committee. The brain purportedly weighed 1,500 grams, which is the upper limit of normal in an adult male, never mind the fact that it was described 25% of it was missing. So Dr. Humes, despite his steadfast claim to the contrary, was not in full control of the autopsy. The Kennedy family was limiting the amount of dissection and examination that could be performed, and Dr. Humes at one point became very frustrated, and he yelled into the gallery, "Who's in charge here?" And again, Dr. Fink, testifying to the Shaw trial, he said that an unnamed Army general replied, "I am." Dr. Fink, again, did admit that the back wound was probed, but that the pathology team could not track the wound through JFK's body. Dr. Fink said they were told not to track this wound. Fink requested to examine JFK's clothing. His request was denied. All of the Bethesda personnel were given a gag order. They were ordered not to talk about what they had seen, specifically by Admiral Kenny, who was the Surgeon General of the entire Navy. So getting back to Kennedy's back wound, if the wound was too low on the back, obviously it could not have swung upward and exited from the front of JFK's throat and continued on to do the damage to Governor Connally necessitated by the single bullet theory. So it's important to pin down the location where exactly this wound was. And the death certificate, which was signed by Admiral Berkeley, who was Kennedy's personal physician, places this wound at the level of the 3rd thoracic vertebrae, which is the middle of the back and not the neck. Secret Service agents Kellerman, Greer, and Hill were brought into the morgue after the autopsy. They were asked to view the body expressly for the purpose of describing where the wounds were. And in this case, all 3 placed the wound about 6 inches down on the back. This location is consistent with the bullet holes in Kennedy's sport jacket and his shirt, exactly in that location. And interestingly enough, the Warren Commission moved that wound up. They had to if they wanted to allow it to exit from the front of the throat. And Humes and Boswell, irregardless of the fact that their autopsy face sheets show the back wound 6 inches down where it's supported to be, they said that was a diagram error. Obviously, if the wound was that far down, could not have exited from the front of the throat. And it is in itself inexcusable that Humes and Boswell didn't even realize there was a bullet wound there until they spoke with Dr. Perry the next day. The body at that point was already lying in state. I want to discuss the photographs and the x-rays. Obviously, time does not permit me to get into all of the irregularities that occur here, but the first irregularity that arises, 3 different people claim to have taken the x-rays. Many pro-conspiracy researchers believe that the x-rays are not of Kennedy for the important reason that it appears some of the bone in the front of the skull is missing. This bone was supposedly intact during the autopsy. It was not removed. And obviously, x-rays showing bone missing from the front of the head would support a shot entering the back of the head and exploding out the right front, which would be consistent with a shot from behind. But again, the damage to this area of the head, while it's apparently visible in the Zapruder film after the headshot, It was not noticed by anyone at Parkland, and the morticians who were preparing JFK's body for burial described the face as being intact. So the charges that the autopsy x-rays are incompatible with the Parkland descriptions can be established. And sadly, the claim that they are outright forgeries is much, much harder to prove. The x-rays were authenticated by a panel from the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978, and so far no one has really been able to conclusively prove how fake x-rays can be produced. But the autopsy photographs have come into a great deal of question because some of them, again, contradict the descriptions of the medical personnel in Parkland. And foremost is the photograph of the back of the head. The back of the head appears to be intact. And again, I read you the descriptions of the Dallas physicians describing it as being blasted out. The entrance wound for the head shot occurring from behind, which is visible at the top of the head, was not noticed by anyone in Dallas. No one saw it. The entrance wound on the head, again, moved because originally it was in the hairline, cited there by several Secret Service agents, but the House Select Committee's placement, in fact, is 10 centimeters further away from where Humes, Boswell, and Fink said it was. Dr. Humes, when he testified to the House Select Committee, defied the investigators to find the entrance wound clearly visible on the color photograph in the same photograph in black and white. It's just not there. In the photographs of the back of the head, the area in the occiput, which was described as being blasted out, is intact. The back of the head photo is out of focus in particular areas as well. The area at the top of the head, which should be in focus, is not. The hair lay patterns are different. The hair above the middle of the head is shiny and wet. The hair below this area is dry and it's much lighter than the rest of the hair. Photographs of Kennedy's chest interior vanished from the National Archives. Dr. Humes said, quote, "We were distressed not to find that particular photograph." Dr. Humes, Dr. Boswell, and Dr. Fink cataloged the photographs, and they described taking a great deal of effort to get a photograph of the interior of the chest, and again, that photograph is missing. The right profile photograph of Kennedy's head has enough problems in it to occupy our time by itself. In the color pictures of this scene, the right profile, there are dark red stripes hanging from the head, supposedly brain tissue. In the black and white pictures, they're gray. So what we have here is a photographic impossibility. Red goes to black in black and white, not gray. So someone has been tampering with these photographs. And those are just a few of the problems with the autopsy photographs. Several Bethesda witnesses, even some of the people who said they took them, have stated that the physical features in the morgue, like in one photograph there's a phone, there's an instrument tray visible, and the tile floor, some of the witnesses have said that those features simply did not exist in the Bethesda morgue, which would imply that they were taken at another location. So to get back to the x-rays, there's the matter of the bullet fragments which are found in Kennedy's head. And the pathologists describe removing 2 small fragments from the head, but there is no mention made of a large 6.5 millimeter fragment visible clearly on the x-rays. It's a round bullet fragment visible on the anteroposterior x-ray. How could this fragment have been ignored by 3 pathologists who were expressly looking for bullet fragments? Dr. Ebersol, who was a radiologist at at Bethesda, who said he took some of the autopsy x-rays, could not recall having seen this fragment clearly visible when he was interviewed by Dr. David Mantic. And the trail of bullet fragments reported by Dr. Humes begins at the external occipital protuberance in the back of the head. Dr. Ebersol's testimony supports this, but in the x-rays, especially the lateral x-ray, the trail is much higher on the head. So which one is correct? We are not even sure if the x-rays were taken before or after the brain was removed. We know that some of the x-rays were taken at the outset of the autopsy because some of the personnel were asked to leave. But Gerald Custer, who was one of the men who took the x-rays, was an x-ray technician at Bethesda. He was asked about that bullet fragment, the 6.5 millimeter fragment visible on the x-rays, and he said about that, quote, "It can't be. I don't understand where that bullet could have been on the skull. It would have shown," end quote. Interestingly enough, Custer said that he x-rayed pieces of bullet that were taped to bone fragments the day after the assassination. He said he was told that this was to make a bust of President Kennedy. He insists that more x-rays were taken than what's available to the researchers in this case presently. Custer can attest to the fact that personnel were asked to leave the autopsy room right after the body was taken out, and according to him, when he and the other men that were asked to leave returned 45 minutes later, Dr. Ebersol had already taken some x-rays. The photographs show an intact face. The witnesses describe an intact face, and there is no documentation suggesting that the bones of the face or the forehead were removed. So if the x-rays do indeed show that the frontal bone is missing, then we have a serious problem. Who is right and who is wrong? Dr. Joseph Riley examined the x-rays, and he concluded that Kennedy was shot twice in the head based on the x-ray evidence, once at the point that the pathologists identified, and once at the higher point suggested by the Clark panel and the House Select Committee on Assassinations. In 1993, a color copy of what is called the stare of death photograph, which is JFK on the table, the autopsy table, a color photograph of that picture turned up in a video which was produced by a California company. A color version of this photograph had never before been seen. And this photograph contains what is apparently a cut above JFK's throat, about an inch before the top of it. So I want to move away now from the mumbo-jumbo of x-rays and photographs and talk a bit about the single bullet theory. And it's hard, really, to find a place to begin. To define it, basically Kennedy was struck in the back from behind. The bullet exited the front of the throat, then continued on to strike Governor Connally in the back. It shattered one of his ribs. It exited from his chest, entered into his wrist, broke his wrist, exited his wrist, lodged in his thigh, and left a fragment there. And I think most of us would agree that that's quite a remarkable bullet, regardless of the state that it's in. And without getting into a debate whether Kennedy and Connally were aligned properly, because again, that's a matter that occupies a lot of time, I want to try to examine the problem medically. What did the people in the know have to say about this? The Warren Commission had to get the doctors to reverse themselves. They said the wound in JFK's throat was one of entrance rather than exit. So Arlen Specter, Warren Commission counsel, had to get them to reverse themselves in order for the bullet to exit from the throat and continue on to strike Governor Connally. So Arlen Specter asked the Dallas physicians the following loaded question, quote, "First, assume that the president was struck when he was approximately 160 to 250 feet from the weapon, being struck from the rear at a downward angle on the upper right posterior thorax. Assume further that the missile passed through the body of the president, striking no bones, traversing the neck, and sliding between the large muscles, then exiting precisely at the point you observed the puncture wound to exist. Now, based on those facts, was the appearance of the wound, in your opinion, consistent with being an exit wound?" Again, quite a question. And some of the doctors, like Dr. Perry, agreed with Arlen Specter. They said, yeah, that could be an exit wound. But other doctors, they saw through that. They said that there's no way that the wound was that small, because bullets traveling that fast, the shock waves, the bullet tends to wobble, and it causes a great deal of damage to the throat. How did the Bethesda pathologists feel about the single bullet theory? Dr. Hume said, "I think it is most unlikely." Dr. Fink said, "There's no way bullet 399 could have caused the wound in Governor Connally's wrist, quote, for the reason that there are too many fragments described in that wrist." So even the Bethesda people didn't believe this. Obviously, a wound low on the back could not have exited from JFK's throat, and it could not have continued on to strike Governor Connally. The single bullet theory is just not supported by a single eyewitness to the assassination. Not even the members of the Warren Commission believed it. This is three strikes against this here. Senator Russell, Senator Cooper, and Congressman Boggs agreed that this hypothesis was just untenable. It's difficult to reconcile the fact that two bullets supposedly fired from Oswald's gun, same type of ammunition, same rifle, would behave so differently inside Kennedy's body. The magic bullet passes through barely deformed, and seconds later, the bullet that hits Kennedy in the head explodes, fragments into 40 pieces. So there's no doubt that the single bullet theory is one of the most controversial aspects of the Kennedy assassination. It does not appear that it'll ever be proven one way or the other. Governor Connally carried vital bullet fragments with him to his grave, and these fragments really may have shed new light on the probability of CE 399 causing all of his wounds. Failure Analysis Incorporated, a company in California, created a very sophisticated computer model of Dealey Plaza, in association with the American Bar Association's mock trial for Oswald, and Gerald Posner used this extensively in his book Case Closed. It tends to support the single bullet theory by tracing the shot back to Oswald's sixth-floor window. And needless to say, the puzzle of the single bullet theory helps to make the medical evidence one of the more major stumbling blocks to researchers in this case. So where do we go with the medical evidence from here? Perhaps the release of all the autopsy materials would be a good place to start. The charge of body alteration is something that needs to be addressed. Some people even suggest that President Kennedy should be exhumed. But whatever we as a research community decide to do, we must continue to search for the truth in the medical evidence, regardless of what theory it supports.
Thank you, Jonathan. Let's switch gears here now and hear from Brother Jim Mars.
Well, we're kind of running late, so once again I seem to be in the position of, hey, I got a minute and a half to tell you everything that's happened in 30 years. So pardon me if I start rattling, but there's a lot that I'd like to tell you. Basically, I appreciate each and every one of these panel members. I think we've heard some excellent information here this afternoon. I want to stress to you that the single bullet theory cannot be overemphasized. It cannot be discussed enough. It is the crux of this whole case. I do disagree with Jonathan that we'll never know in the medical evidence. It's there if you want to look. Kennedy, remember this, Kennedy was never shot through the neck. He was never shot through the neck. He was shot in the back, and the wound did not track. That destroys the single bullet theory right there. If it did track, and they're saying, well, they just couldn't probe it, they didn't do it right or whatever. Okay, if the back wound does connect to the throat wound, it's an upward trajectory. It cannot go down and strike Connolly. It's that simple, folks. Case closed. Now let's go back real quick to the time it happened. We've been hearing mostly the evidence of what happened that weekend. I want to touch on a little bit of that real quick. I was, in preparation for this and for some other events coming up, I was perusing through, I have a huge stack of old yellowed newspapers from Dallas-Fort Worth from that weekend that I kept myself, okay? And so I think I can say I've been on this case since the day it happened. It's really interesting to read what the initial news reports state, okay? We all know that our first impression of somebody or of a situation generally is correct. What happens is we start rationalizing and say, well, he seems like a slime ball, but maybe he's okay. And then later on you find out, yeah, he really is a slime ball, okay? Our initial impressions are correct. And so I was really fascinated to read these initial accounts. The Florida Star Telegram, Jerry Fleming states, without any attribution, just as a plain statement of fact, that Kennedy was shot in the right temple. Well, you can't get shot in the right temple, and by the way, that's where Malcolm Kilduff, the White House spokesman at Parkland, said, yeah, it's a simple shot right in the head, this way, okay? And of course, this explains the blown out rear part of the head. And while I'm on that, I got to make one observation. We're told that the bullet came in right here at the top of the skull and somehow blew out the right side, which has never made any sense to me. A bullet is a supersonic, high-powered projectile, and it goes on a straight line trajectory. If he's hit here, the whole front of his face should have been blown off, or certainly a large hole in his forehead. That didn't happen. We've got the photographs. It didn't happen. How's the bullet come this way and come out this way? The JAMA panel showed, well, the bullet kind of came at a leftward angle and came out the right side of his head. How does that work? The schoolbook depository is way off to his right slightly, you know, so now we got to come in this way. It's absolutely incredible. The only thing you can say with absolute truth about the medical evidence is that it is in such total disarray that even the experts cannot agree on what it means. And folks, why is it this way? We're not talking about Joe Blow street bum that they picked up and some half-drunk local JP says, oh, well, he's shot in the head, and they pack him off. We're talking about the President of the United States, okay? Use your heads. Let's start thinking for ourselves here. I'll get to that later. All right, that weekend. The next day, The Fort Worth Press, this is great, quoted Secret Service agents as saying that there was a burst of automatic rifle fire, apparently from the grassy knoll where all the lawmen raced to find out what had happened. Hey, there you go. Saturday morning edition of the Dallas News, I believe it was, quotes Henry Wade saying, "We are developing evidence that there was a vast conspiracy and my office will never stop until every single individual involved is brought to justice." Well, by that afternoon, he's saying, well, actually, Oswald did it all by himself beyond any certainty of doubt. Come on. What we had then, we have now, is facts and information versus official pronouncements, okay? So that weekend was total chaos, but they were trying to do an investigation. Now, I don't want to try to defend the Dallas police too much. They were a bunch of good old boys, and they were not the highly trained police department that they are today. I was flabbergasted recently to be talking to a member of the Dallas Police Public Relations, and I said, by the way, how many officers in Dallas today have a college degree or equivalent? And I knew it had gone up. I knew it was pretty high. I expect him to say 75, 80%. 100% of the Dallas Police Department today has a college degree or equivalent. I think that's wonderful, okay? That was not the case in '63, all right? The other thing, and here's a key point to remember, officially, the FBI was never called into this case until Monday following the death of Oswald. This was a Texas homicide, and I think most of you all are aware that Kennedy's body was taken totally illegally out of Dallas. If we had had an autopsy here, if we had followed the law, we probably wouldn't have all these questions. Of course, we would have had a revolution, okay, because the conspiracy would have been revealed. All right, but it was a Texas homicide. What nobody seems to understand, but it's well documented, absolute fact, is that the night of the assassination, with no legal standing but on orders from J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI took away the evidence from the Dallas police. They took away the rifle, they took away the shell cases, they took away the jackets, they took away all this evidence that we're going to be arguing over this weekend. And that was the start of the problem. It all comes back to the federal authorities, okay? Never lose sight of that. Quickly on the Tippit thing, this can't be understated either, because the Tippit shooting was one of the prime arguments in favor of Oswald's guilt in the Kennedy assassination. Conventional wisdom in '63, '64, even people who were willing to say, well, he's innocent until proven guilty, said, well, if he didn't shoot the president, why did he shoot the cop? Okay, well, of course, now, and after Larry Harris's presentation, and I guarantee you look at the evidence, and now we can reverse that conventional wisdom. We can say it seems pretty obvious that Oswald did not shoot the policeman, so maybe he didn't shoot the president. And by the way, I want to add one other thing to Larry's very excellent representation of the facts of the Tippit case. Let's pretend we're at a trial here. There are 3 living witnesses in Dallas today, including Butch Burroughs, the assistant manager of the Texas Theater, Jack Davis, a radio evangelist, and an insurance salesman whose name escapes me, who are alive today and who would testify in a court of law and have told me personally that they encountered and saw Oswald in the Texas Theater at no later than 1:10 p.m. on Friday, November the 22nd. Butch Burroughs is in the Warren Commission and is in all the books talking about this man who entered at about 1:35 and apparently slipped up into the balcony, okay? He will still tell you that story. But if you'll stop and really talk with him, you'll find out that he'll tell you that wasn't Oswald. Oswald came in not more than 10 minutes after the show started, which was 1 o'clock, and that a few minutes later he came out and bought popcorn from Butch Burroughs. If we're in a courtroom here, you can forget your shell cases and the questions and the bullets don't match and nobody can actually pin, the lineups were, unfair. All of this stuff is in such disarray, and you get 3 living witnesses who have no contact with each other who would get up and swear an oath that they saw Oswald in the theater at the time Tippit was being slain. He would have walked. He would have walked. That's reasonable doubt. We all would have let him go, okay? But see, you don't even get to hear about this stuff. All right, another thing quickly on the arrest of Oswald is that we talked about, and it was well defined, how that Officer McDonald said Oswald pulled his .38, aimed it at his stomach, and it snapped, okay? But it didn't go off. The Warren Commission tries to fudge this, and if you'll go back and read what they actually say, they don't say that he stuck his hand between the hammer and the gun, but they say that's standard procedure. So they try to leave you with the intimation that McDonald stuck his hand down there between the hammer and the gun, and that's what prevented it from going off. That never happened. McDonald himself wrote about the arrest the day afterwards, and nowhere does he mention, boys, my hand's sore. And believe me, you stick this part of your hand between a hammer and cold metal with a pin on it and it snaps it, you're going to know that you did that. It didn't happen. So why the confusion? Why do they try to act like that he stuck his hand in there and prevented the gun from going off? Because I've talked to more than one policeman who said the next day Officer McDonald was going around the police station proudly displaying this bullet which had a dented primer. And he said, look how close I came from getting killed, okay? Why didn't it go off? The primer was dented. It's not the shell, it's something's wrong with the pistol. And that brings us up to the allegations that the FBI had to straighten the firing pin a little bit on Oswald's pistol to make it work so they could test it. All right? And of course, the reason you don't hear about that and the reason those documents have probably long been shredded is because if the pistol wouldn't work in the Texas theater to shoot McDonald, how could it have worked 15 minutes earlier to shoot Tippit? It couldn't have. So the whole thing is just a mess. So that was what went on early on. And then what happened, though, was once Oswald's dead, everything shifts. Through that weekend, it was, did Oswald commit the crime? Once Oswald's dead, they even quit referring to him as the accused assassin. He's just the assassin. And the emphasis shifts from did he do the deed to why did he do it? And you see that continuing through today, the Frontline special, which is just mind-boggling. You know, they spent the whole time on Oswald. There was never any question of did he do it or not. It's just, you know, is he capable? Is he a bad guy? You know, you could go on and on about that. So what happened is that the initial impressions, the initial reports from the witnesses, the initial evidence suddenly is under the carpet. And all we have is official pronouncements. And that is solidified in the end of September 64 when they present the Warren Commission report. Okay? Then what happens is that several weeks, even into 64, even in 65, polls showed that the bigger bulk of the public still did not really believe that Oswald acted alone. All right? But the official pronouncements were there. And you got to understand, people, I see a lot of young faces in this audience. I also see a lot of faces look kind of like mine, so I guess we got a good mixture here. But keep in mind, you've got to go back and consider what we've been told all through this thing, okay? Early on, it was Oswald. The government didn't know anything about him. He was not connected to anybody. He kind of fell between the cracks, okay? And he did it all by himself. We were a naive nation in 1963 and in 1964. And if J. Edgar Hoover says 2 + 2 is 5, we'd all just kind of scratch our head and go, well, gee, I always thought it was 4, but if he says it's 5, it must be. And that's what's going on. And that's what happened to the news media at that time, by the way. They were sandbagged by the official pronouncements, and they were just simply, they did not have the experience, the background to even think, to question what the authorities would tell them. Today we're in a cynical time when we almost know that everything they tell us is probably not true, you know? But all this changed as the 60s wore on. In 68, with the death of Robert Kennedy and with the death of Martin Luther King, a lot of people began to go, what the heck is going on? And then came Vietnam. We were told, light at the end of the tunnel, light at the end of the tunnel. And now we find out that, no, there wasn't light at the end of the tunnel. You know, and they were lying to us all through Vietnam. Then came Watergate, which actually really proved it. And this was the big stumbling block. This is when I got over the hump, okay? It was about 1972 and 73, long before Nixon resigned. But it became obvious, and it's documented, that yes, there are conspiracies in high positions of this government. And yes, folks, they will lie to you, okay? Now, coming on the heels of Watergate, we had the Church Committee. And the Church Committee starts looking into the activities of the CIA. And I guarantee you, back in the 60s, if me or anybody else had gotten up and said, well, the CIA's working with the mafia, we'd have been stoned, okay? That'd have been the end of that. But the Church Committee documented it. So now we have the two chief suspects in this assassination, the CIA and the mafia, and we find out they're two sides of the same coin. And they're working for the same people, and the same people are involved. Hello? You know, so we start looking at that. Then comes the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which was quite incredible. To begin with, all of the important witnesses they wanted to talk to conveniently died before they could be called to question. Oh, 77 was a bad year for all kinds of people. You know, mafia leaders, George DeMarnshall, bam, they're just gone. And the ones that get me, and I detail this in Crossfire, 7 top FBI officials, all of whom were involved in the Kennedy case and were going to be slated to be called to testify to the House committee, and they all died in a 4-month period. One fell off a ladder, one had a heart attack, one got shot in his backyard by the son of a New Hampshire state patrolman, mistook him for a deer. And there was no investigation, no real investigation. Come on, people, something stinks in Denmark here. We got to start paying attention. But what we learned through the church committee is, yes, the CIA and the mafia were involved in plots that included assassination. And it wasn't just 1 or 2 world leaders. They were going after several world leaders. So attacking a world leader was nothing new to them. And then the House committee, though, after developing some very, very crucial information, such as in the Tippit slaying that shows that he was shot, the killer walked around the car and shot him right in the head. That's not the action of somebody who's simply trying to escape. That's the action of somebody who wants that person dead. Okay, and unless you want to postulate that Oswald just had a penchant for shooting people in the head, there's really no excuse for all that, okay? And yet, despite all the things the House committee did, it was rife with politics. CIA guys were sneaking around, looking at their stuff, stealing their stuff, swiping stuff. People were pitted against each other. Politics, the political aspect of this thing is obvious. Should be obvious to everybody. It needs to be obvious to you. All right? And so the House committee, though, came right up to the 11th hour and all set to say that Oswald did it with 3 shots all by himself, and then they're tripped up on their acoustical evidence. They got 2 separate sets of acoustical scientists that say past a 95% probability that there was at least 1 shot that came from the grassy knoll. So the House committee that we're paying for with our tax money ends up telling us, well, we've got evidence, scientific evidence, supported by a lot of other evidence and eyewitnesses that there was a gunman on the grassy knoll, but we don't know who he was, and he probably missed. So it's still Oswald with 3 shots from the school book depository. And today, your news media just totally, like that didn't happen. They ignore that. That didn't happen. It's Oswald all by himself. Well, but the House committee began to shift the public consciousness. I know in my classes at the University of Texas at Arlington, starting in 1980, right after their pronouncements, the public opinion started shifting. Before that, everybody thought Oswald was the lone assassin. Starting in 80, it started shifting. By the fall of 1984, and since that time, not one single person showed up out at the university to take a course on assassination who truly believes that Oswald was the lone assassin. Okay, so there was quite a turnaround in the public opinion. And then that brings us to the Stone movie. Prior to the Stone movie, it was not socially acceptable to even talk about the assassination in polite company. You just couldn't even discuss it. If you tried to bring it up with your friends and your relatives, they go, you some kind of nut, you some kind of buff, be quiet, The Stone movie put it on the table, and I'm not going to try to tell you that movie may have been the absolute 100%, carved in rock truth, but by God, it's closer than anything else we got. And the point is, it presented this massive amount of assassination material to the general public without being filtered through a handful of news media controllers in the national media. That's why they went berserk and ballistic. They couldn't stand it. Now, that brings us up to today. So, the last 3 or 4 years, more and more people, now you can talk about it. Now that you can talk about it openly, all this information is trickling down. People are hearing about it. Nobody believes the lone assassin theory anymore. In fact, I just heard of a poll that was commissioned just last week. I forget now who did it. It may have been USA Today. I don't know. Over 90% of the public today disbelieves the lone assassin theory, okay? Now, what puzzles me and intrigues me is that 9 or 10% all seem to be working in the media. They're still there. And, of course, that brings us to Gerald Posner, or Posner, or whatever he is. And you'll hear a lot about this, and I understand there's even going to be a panel on it, but I just got to add my 2 cents worth. Number one, he's a lawyer. That ought to be enough said. But, no, seriously, some of my best friends are lawyers. But the point is, he has presented a very articulate prosecution of Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, that may be very commendable in a courtroom, but in a courtroom, there's such a thing as a defense attorney. And the defense attorney can bring in his own witnesses and his own evidence and cross-examine the prosecution. There was no defense attorney in case closed. And for that reason, I think Posner has written a despicably dishonest book. And quickly, I want to add one other thing. Jonathan mentioned the computer model by Failure Analysis Associates, which Posner uses to great effect, and was used, by the way, to great effect on the Frontline special. And as he pointed out, Posner in his book leaves the impression that that was his computer model, that he ordered it, he contracted for it. It's not so. The American Bar Association contracted for these computer models through Failure Analysis for the mock trial of Lee Harvey Oswald through the court channel a couple of years ago. And what Posner and Frontline fails to tell us is that they contracted for 2 computer models. One for the prosecution that shows by computer that Oswald could have been the lone assassin. And 2, one for the defense, which by computer model proved that Oswald could not possibly have been the lone assassin. And which one does Posner present to us? Only the prosecution. And does not even tell us that there was a defense. That's his book in a nutshell. It's one-sided, it's despicably dishonest. And Frontline, those of you that are old enough and think back over this case, we've been told Oswald was connected to nobody. He was just a loner and a nut, and nobody would have anything to do with him, and nobody knew anything about him. And now we get public television, which gives us the conspiracy case as a given. Yes, we found he was connected to the CIA, and yes, the Russians thought he was a spy, and yeah, he was in touch with all these FBI guys in Fort Worth and in New Orleans, and yeah, we've got a photographic proof that he was in touch with David Ferry, and we know he was in 544 Camp Street with Guy Bannister, yeah, just like Garrison told us, just like Oliver Stone told us, but that doesn't mean anything. He did it all by himself. Come on, folks. Come on. How big of fools do they think we are? Apparently, they think we're pretty big. Pretty big fools. Well, let me tell you something. There's an overt thing going on. Posner's book, by the way, off the air, unfortunately, I asked Posner, who was, by the way, one of the leading spokesmen on the Frontline special. I asked him, I said, how did you get a first-hand sit-down interview with Yuri Nosenko, the KGB defector that the CIA's been protecting? And he said, yes, they had to protect him. Said the KGB had a contract out on him. Said they were going to kill him. Said they had to keep him under wraps. And I said, well, how do you get an interview with him? Oh, the CIA helped me get an interview with him. Keep that in mind. Okay? So by this and the Frontline, it should be obvious to everybody that there is still very powerful forces in this country that have apparently unlimited funds and have an agenda to push. And when they're pushed into a corner by researchers, they'll go, well, yeah, that's right, but he did it all by himself. It's just like I was in California a couple of years ago with Wesley Liebler, and he's sitting there haranguing a group of press people, news media people, TV cameramen, trying to explain the single bullet theory. And he kept saying Kennedy was shot through the neck, Kennedy shot through the neck, and he hit Connally. And I couldn't stand it. I said, Mr. Liebler, excuse me. You know that he was not shot through the neck. You know that the bullet went in his back. And what was his response? Well, the back, whatever. Oswald did it all by himself. There's an overt and a covert message going on here. The overt thing is they've got to keep it confused. If they keep it confused, then they keep the public from rallying and from demanding that something be done about this. I applaud each and every one of you that come to this ASK conference and are trying to find the truth, and I would exhort you to go back home to your respective homes and tell people what you know and spread the word, because it ain't going to happen through the news media, obviously. Also, hound your local news media. Call them up. Call her hand on it when they don't do that. Marguerite Oswald did that all the time. When the Star Telegram would run some article and call her son the assassin, Bang, she's on the telephone. He's the accused assassin. All right? Do the same thing. Keep their feet to the fire. They claim to be the watchdog of the public. They claim to wrap themselves in First Amendment rights. Make them do their job. Okay? So here we are today, and we're no better off than we were in 1963, 64. It is the news media frames the controversy. Okay? Back then it was shots from the school book depository, and people said, no, there were shots from the knoll, and they framed the controversy in, well, it was either or. You know, well, some people think the shots came from the knoll, but the evidence shows the shots came from the book depository. Hey, folks, came from both. What I really liked was to look at the witnesses that were standing between those two locations. What do they say? People up right around the depository, a great many of them, perhaps most of them, said they thought the shots came from that location. The people down in the plaza, almost unanimously, I can only think of two people who were the closest people to Kennedy, and that was Mary Mormon and Charles Brim. Those are the only two I can think of that did not indicate that they thought the shots came from the grassy knoll. And they didn't say it came from the depository. They just said, I couldn't tell where it came from. Okay? So they try to frame the thing as it had to come from here or here, but look at the witnesses in the middle. There were shots here, there were shots here. Came from both places. Now we're seeing the same thing going on today. Now they're trying to frame the controversy and trying to style it that Oswald either did it all by himself or he was an innocent patsy. Well, folks, there's plenty of latitude in between there, okay? Plenty of latitude. I, for one, don't believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was some innocent guy off the street that was just pulled in and named as the assassin. He was involved, but he was involved exactly as his mother and his wife Marina has publicly stated. He was an agent of the United States government, and he was mixed up in this whole thing, and I think he was reporting back to his superiors on what was going to happen. That's why they had to destroy the Hosty note. That's why the Dallas police, out of their files, was taken the letter to the Dallas police signed Heidel, written in Lee Harvey Oswald's handwriting, that's warned that Kennedy was going to be killed in Dallas. Okay, he knew something heavy was going on. He was reporting back to his normal superiors, but he knew enough to try to even go outside the normal channels and warn of what was going on. And I don't think there was anybody more surprised to hear that President Kennedy had been killed than Lee Harvey Oswald, even though he knew there was some stuff going on and plots were going on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right, but again, they try to frame the controversy. He's either innocent or he's guilty. Now, you know, it could be in between. And so here we are in 1993. We've had this whole thing. He did it. Well, maybe he didn't do it. Here's this fact shot down. Well, here's another fact, that fact shot down. Here's more pronouncements, and we're still where we've always been. The facts speak for themselves, but they can't seem to overcome the official pronouncements. All right? So keep that in mind. Trust nobody, me included. Question everybody and think for yourselves. Thanks. Have a good conference.
Thank you, Brother Jim Mars. We're running dreadfully short on time. We're going to try to take a few questions. If you want to line up over here to the right, come up to the microphone and direct your question to any of us. We've only got about 6 minutes left, so we're only going to take a few questions, okay?
Keep in mind, too, that probably a lot of the questions you have will be answered at the various panels of this conference.
And you can feel free to come up and talk with us afterward.
Yeah.
Okay, I have one quick question for anybody who can answer up there, maybe Jim or somebody. Marion Baker has always intrigued me. Why is he the only person in the whole parade or motorcade route who stops, runs up into the depository building and says shots were there, puts a pistol on Lee Harvey Oswald, it was a minute 20 of the shooting, and nobody grills him as to why he was the only one who did that?
Well, let me answer real quick. He said that he was riding up Houston Street, heard shots, thought they came from the direction of the depository, and saw pigeons fly off the roof of the building, and he thought somebody was shooting from the roof of the building. That's why he went there.
I've read that. I mean, the bottom line is I heard that he and Truly said they wanted to get to the 6th floor to look into the parking lot behind.
No. He was going to the roof, and he got Truly enlisted Truly's aid to try to get to the roof.
Why would he pull a pistol on Oswald's stomach, though? Why was he a suspect as a murderer right then?
He wasn't.
Yes.
He saw a man. He was looking for somebody. He saw a man in the lunchroom. He burst in the door. I can't even remember if he said he.
You read the Warren Commission report. He's got a pistol on Oswald's
Okay, he had
stomach.
a pistol, and he said, "Hold it." And he turns to Truly. He said, "You know this man?" Truly says, "Yeah, he works here." So he kept going.
But that seems kind of fishy, a pistol on the stomach.
Maybe, I don't know.
I want to talk about Mr. Cohen is a so-called expert on the medical evidence and saying that the single bullet theory cannot be proven. There's heavy evidence, but there's absolutely simple, incontrovertible, without a doubt evidence that he could not have been hit a single bullet. Anyone in this audience, your 10-year-old kids could prove it. You could prove it to your 10-year-old kids, and I'll tell you how you do it. And I am disappointed in Mr. Cohen, and even despite in the last assassination, the last symposium, one of the final statements that, the consensus statement said that Conley was shot a lot later than generally assumed. We are being sandbagged. We are sandbagged by Hosea Thompson, by Mr. Cohen, and these experts. We are sandbagged, maybe innocently, maybe not so innocently. Here's the way we're sandbagged. You get out volume 18. Volume 18. Wait, no,
Do you have a question?
Volume 18, I'll ask you the question. If you look at volume 18, pages 1 to 18 of the Warren Commission report, the Zapruder pictures are shown frame by frame.
And they were transposed. And J. Edgar Hoover
I
wrote a
know,
letter and
that's
said,
not what
"Sorry,
I meant.
we made a mistake."
But they could not hide the fact that Connolly turned much later than they said. Connolly could not have turned.
Sir, yep.
And I'm saying, how could you, Mr.
Well-
Cohen, I'll ask you the question, how could you present your case and not see that Connolly was shot much later because he clearly turns? There's no way in hell or heaven that he could have.
Let's debate that after. Let's debate that afterward.
Well,
Okay. We appreciate your comments, but
Okay.
Just let me say that
I'm saying to this audience, you go and look at
No,
those
sir.
pictures and prove it to yourself.
I make no claim to be a medical expert of any kind, just so that.
I'd just like to make an observation. My name's Dave Hall from Munising, Michigan. Last year here at the symposium, I picked up a copy of the Zapruder enhancement that Bob Groden had made. And in reviewing that, and anybody that has seen that, you look at the alignment of Jackie Kennedy at the crucial second that John is shot, and you look at that and you think that if that shot came from the book depository, look at her alignment and where she was, wouldn't she have been struck by something, by a fragment or anything from that particular shot? So to me, when you look at that movie itself, that dispels any thought that that particular shot could have come from the book depository. Jim, I'd like to address one thing to you in regards to the Billy Harper fragment. Is there anybody that has done any thorough investigation of the Billy Harper fragment that was found in Dealey Plaza so that I understood that he took it to his uncle who said, yes, it was a fragment from the head. But what's happened to that fragment, and has that ever been concluded that, in fact, that was from John Kennedy? Because obviously that would point to a shot that came from the grassy knoll.
Harper's uncle, by the way, was a forensic pathologist, and he has identified it as a piece of the occipital bone, which is the big bone in the back of your head, which is totally consistent with the idea of the big hole right here that was blown out, okay? We know that. We got to thank God he went and showed it to his uncle. His uncle took a photograph of it. We've got a piece of it, and it does seem to match the normal occipital bone. As to what happened to it, it finally was turned over to the federal authorities, FBI. That's the end of that.
Okay, and Tom, state your question, and we'll try to let this young man behind you pose his question. I'm afraid we're going to have to cut this off because we're down to under 2 minutes now.
Okay,
I apologize.
I'll be very brief. First, I want to ask Jim where we can see this video that the ABA model made of the ABA model for the defense.
Failure Analysis Associates. Contact them. They're in Menlo Park, California.
Okay. Also, there are pictures of the limousine after the assassination showing the bullet that apparently went through the glass windshield, also a bullet that landed in the chrome piece at the top of the windshield. Mm-hmm. Has anyone done any scientific tests to show the trajectories of those bullets?
Tom, all we have are those photographs because Lyndon Johnson ordered that car rebuilt, and there went the evidence.
I understand.
I just have one question. Do you think Oswald shot the gun? And if he did, what were the results of the paraffin tests?
Well, I don't think he shot the gun, and the paraffin tests were inconclusive that day. He was tested for, the paraffin tests were, he was tested his right cheek and on both of his hands. And the testing showed, in the immortal words of Henry Wade, that he had fired a gun. Well, they wouldn't say he'd fired a rifle because the test on his cheek was negative.
Negative on the cheek,
right,
is pretty strong evidence that he had not fired a rifle.
That's right. And paraffin tests, though, are notoriously unreliable. You can score positive on a paraffin test from something as simple as urine on your hands or anything. I mean, there's a number of things that can cause that.
Thank you.
Okay.
One more.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to cut it off. The time is out. If you would
30
like...
seconds? This is real important. Is there any way that Kennedy could have been tipped, if he wasn't standing bolt upright, that the bullet could have entered the back and gone out the throat? If you're up like this, it wouldn't, but any other angle possible.
Quickly, the House committee tried to come up with this because they pretty well correctly understood the wound was in the back below the shoulder blades, so they came up with an explanation. It seems that Kennedy, at the moment of the shot, bent over. For some reason, I don't know, bent over. And the shot hit him in the back and came out his throat. Now, there's only two problems with this, okay? Number one, it didn't happen. We got films, we got witnesses. Nobody saw him bending over. Plus, he had this back brace. It would have made it very difficult for him to bend over rapidly. And the second thing is, think about it. If he did bend over and the shot hit him in the back and it came out his throat, where's the shot going to go? Into Connolly? No, it'll go in the floorboard of the car. So forget that.
Okay. In closing, let me say this. I think we're in general agreement here that if we ever learn the truth about the Kennedy assassination, it will be in spite of and not because of the FBI and the Justice Department and the American government. If the case is ever resolved, it will have been through the dedication, perseverance, and courage of private citizens all over the country, citizens who cared enough about the concepts of truth and justice to get involved, and citizens who I think in many respects represent the best of the American people. Thank you very much. I've been asked to mention, as far as your badges, they now have available lanyards, these straps you can put around your shoulder to attach your badge. Those are available at the registration desk. Thank you very much.